GDP means gross domestic product, and of course there are indicators such as GNP and other gross national products. These two figures generally have little difference, and the international common GDP. Here is a rumor that there is another Japan overseas. Japan's GNP is more than its GDP, but it is only about 1 to 2 percentage points more. The following are mainly the open economic data of China and the United States in 2022. The National Bureau of Statistics, the World Bank and Baidu Search are basically consistent. It can be seen that if we look at the real economy with agriculture and industry as the core alone, China surpasses the United States by a lot. The added value of China's tertiary service industry is less than half that of the United States. In 2022, the added value of the manufacturing industry in China will exceed the sum of US plus Japan plus Germany plus India, which is quite impressive. In my opinion, the three indicators that truly measure the gold content of a country's economic development should be power generation, steel production, and computing power index. The combination of these three indicators can accurately reflect a country's development momentum, the organic structure of industrial production and the level of informatization. Today, when the proportion of digital economy in major economies generally exceeds 50%, the computing power index is already a core economic indicator. The computing power index refers to the 2022 to 2023 Global Computing Power Index Evaluation Report. In terms of computing power scale, China and the United States are the only two players in the world, both of which exceed 30% of the world in terms of computing power and scale. Currently, China lags behind in terms of computing power scale percentage points in the United States. In the past 5 years, the average annual growth rate of my country's total computing power has exceeded 25%. In 2022, the scale of my country's intelligent computing power will reach 268 exabytes per second, EFLOPS, exceeding the scale of general-purpose computing power. It is estimated that in the next 5 years, the compound annual growth rate of my country's intelligent computing power will reach more than 50%. In terms of power generation capacity, China is almost twice that of the United States, and its steel production is nearly 15 times that of the United States. In terms of computing power, China is basically on par, and slightly behind. It can be summed up. From the comparison of traditional GDP between China and the United States, China's industrial and agricultural real economy far exceeds that of the United States, but the added value of the service industry is less than half of that of the United States. This is the main reason for the current GDP gap between the two countries. From the perspective of power generation, steel production, and computing power index, China's economic structure and development momentum are significantly better than those of the United States, and its digital economy is slightly behind the United States. The economic structure of China and the United States is very different. One is dominated by the real economy, supported by manufacturing, the other is dominated by the virtual economy, supported by financial credit. Using GDP indicators to compare the two economies of China and the United States is comparing heights with weight scales, which is completely unscientific and fair. First, the calculation methods of the GDP indicators of the two countries are different, and the US GDP calculation method cannot reflect the creation of wealth. China's GDP statistics method is the production method, while the United States uses the expenditure method. The production method conducts accounting from the perspective of producers or suppliers. That is to add up the market value of the final products and services produced by each production sector. The expenditure method is to calculate from the perspective of the buyer or the demand side. It is calculated by calculating the total expenditure of the whole society to purchase the final product, that is, the total selling price of the final product. Transaction creates value, circulation promotes production. This is the general law of economic development. However, when calculating wealth creation in different links of production or circulation, there will be great deviations. The production method is mainly to calculate the real material wealth created, while the expenditure method will include some non-real wealth because it includes the circulation and use links, such as illegal drug transactions, self-owned housing rent, pornographic transactions, etc. When calculating GDP using the expenditure method that includes circulation links, transaction costs and dissipation of rent will also be included, such as legal proceedings and financial costs that have little to do with wealth creation. It doesn't matter if you don't understand these two economic terms. It can be simply understood that doing useless work can also increase GDP. Of course, readers can feel for themselves which method is easier to blow bubbles. Second, GDP prefers quantity over quality, and pursues incremental rather than stock. GDP focuses only on quantity and ignores quality. All transactions that do not involve currency denominations, housework, volunteering, etc. are not counted in GDP. And wars, pollution, natural disasters, and crimes all trigger a lot of spending, which can make GDP soar rapidly. With reference to Russia's 2022 global GDP ranking, it has risen several places. If it is used to measure the national wealth, that is, the actual assets of the country, GDP is actually only equivalent to a profit and loss statement. Only the increment of a certain year is calculated, rather than a balance sheet that can truthfully reflect the overall health situation. In layman's terms, GDP is an egg and an increment. The chicken that lays eggs is the stock, which is the sum of the country's current wealth. Ukraine's GDP should be good this year, but its balance sheet is abysmal. Although the country has lost a lot of assets and has high debts, it has created a lot of arms trade and asset transactions. A lot of eggs were laid, but all the chickens were sold. Finally, the indicator of GDP is now more of a political tool. During the Cold War, due to the implementation of a highly centralized planned economy in the Soviet Union, there was almost no value added in the circulation link, so the United States and the West have been suppressing it with GDP indicators. At the current stage, the United States is still making revisions on the basis of the original statistical methods. Even in order to increase GDP, they keep issuing bonds to expand, equivalent to mortgaging a chicken, borrowing one more chicken to lay more eggs. The profit and loss statement looks good, but the balance sheet looks terrible. The United States is trying to quench its thirst by drinking poison to increase its GDP, but this is the only way to attract voters in the presidential election and to improve its international status. In contrast, China has been adjusting the structure, raising new breeds, and squeezing water, raising healthy chickens. The effect is not evaluated here, but the way of raising chickens honestly and laying eggs safely is correct. In US dollar terms, China's GDP in 2022 is actually much lower than in 2021. I think that apart from the exchange rate impact caused by the US interest rate hike, the main reason is that China has abandoned the GDP-only theory and the standards for the promotion and appointment of leading cadres are also earlier. Just change from GDP to people's livelihood. This is what we need to re-examine the significance of the GDP indicator. Epilogue. GDP and people's livelihood, people's well-being, are related, but not absolute. Even GDP can distort the true state of the economy. As an ordinary netizen, we should look at the indicator of GDP dialectically. GDP can reflect a certain aspect of the economy, but more aspects will be hidden. We don't care whether China's per capita GDP has declined or increased. Those are all numbers. The real standard of living and the happiness of ordinary people determine everything. GDP is the incremental egg laid by the stock hen. It is an egg.